Welcome to APUSH Unit 6 review, and today we'll be covering these topics. So first, we're going to cover the Industrial Revolution. So let's start off with some big ideas. So by the 1900s, the United States is going to become the leading industrial power in the world. And the Industrial Revolution is going to redefine America economically, socially, and politically. And the rise of big business is going to encourage massive migrations and urbanization. So one big idea is that innovations and inventions are going to redefine daily American life, ultimately changing American society. There's going to be a lot of patents issued during this time. You have Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, which gives women jobs as switchboard workers. You also have Thomas Edison's electric light bulb, as well as Nikola Tesla's AC power. All of these inventions are going to create jobs, modernize society, and do other things. Some key things to know are the assembly line process and Taylorism, which is the scientific management of factories. And really, you can't talk about this time period without talking about railroads, the first major big business. They're very important for a variety of reasons. For one, railroads are going to be absolutely foundational to the massive expansion out west and the settlement of the Great Plains. The legislation you need to know is the Pacific Railroad Act, which charters the first transcontinental railroad. And it's going to heavily rely on Irish and Chinese immigrant labor. And railroads are going to facilitate a lot of foreign and domestic immigration. And these are going to be backed by the government through a lot of favorable subsidies and land grants. And this is because the government during this time is very pro-business, and they're going to want favorable shipping rates as well as settlement in these new areas. And ultimately, these railroads are going to lead to the growth of new cities and industries. In fact, entire industries are going to rely on railroads, as we'll see later. Another key impact of railroads is that they're going to create a national economy. We're going to see a mass distribution of materials and goods, which connects markets, leading to mass production, increased consumerism, and economic specialization. And ultimately, railroads are going to redefine daily American life, though not always for the better. So what do I mean by that? Well, during the Gilded Age, the rise of big business oftentimes created great wealth inequalities, leading to social inequality. Again, the more money you have, the more power you have, and tycoons like Vanderbilt are going to become fabulously wealthy, oftentimes at the expense of the common people. Friendly federal land grants and loans are going to drive a lot of corruption in government. There's going to be a lot of over-speculation. Overbuilding was commonplace, and overvalued stocks are going to be sold to the public, causing these speculative bubbles to burst. You also have pervasive mismanagement and fraud. Some other egregious things were rebates, which were discounts to favorable shippers, which are going to jack up prices for small farmers. There are also pools, which were secret agreements to fix rates and split profits between big companies. And during the Gilded Age, we're going to see monopolies established not only in the railroad industry, but also oil and steel. Two practices that you must know are vertical integration, where you control all aspects of manufacturing, increasing efficiency to beat out your competitors, as well as horizontal integration, where you just straight up buy out or force your competitors to merge and thus control all your competition. Let's go over a big scandal, the credit mobilier scandal. This scandal is going to occur during Grant's presidency and had the vice president and Congress members involved in a railroad stock scandal. There was bribery involved for the government to turn a blind eye to the railroad company and overcharging of the government by $44 million. The big idea here is that the credit mobilier scandal, along with the laissez-faire government policies of the Gilded Age, are going to demonstrate how intertwined politics and big business will be. This is also going to drive a lot of corruption in the government. So we have all of these abuses. Will the government step in to regulate this? The big idea is that during the Gilded Age, there is going to be little or ineffective regulation of the abuses of big business. There's going to be a lot of calls for government intervention, for sure. But the prominent idea during this time is laissez-faire, the idea that the government should leave the economy alone. We're going to see the rise of something called the Grange movement, which consisted of small farmers who were the most vocal about reform. They're going to call for the government regulation of railroad companies, the printing of greenbacks, and others. So how does the government try to regulate big business? Well, in Munn v. Illinois, the Supreme Court ruled that states are able to regulate business. However, in the Wabash case, the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot regulate interstate commerce. The government does eventually pass the Interstate Commerce Act, which creates the ICC to oversee interstate commerce. This is going to ban pools, rate fixing, rebates, and force companies to publish rates. This is going to be the first law that regulates big business in favor of society, but this was not very effective until the progressive movement later on into the 1900s. So during this time, we're also going to see the rise of many heavy industries. While the market revolution saw the rise of light industry, the industrial revolution is going to see the rise of heavy industry. Industries like railroads with Vanderbilt, oil with John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, steel with Andrew Carnegie, and coal. And really the question to keep in mind for all of these industrial capitalists is, are they captains of industry or robber barons? Another thing to know are the economic ideas of the Industrial Revolution. Central to these beliefs was the idea of laissez-faire and the very pro-business government during this time. One idea that rises to prominence is going to be social Darwinism, which was survival of the fittest but applied at a societal level. This idea essentially stated that the poor were simply weaker and deserved to die off, while the rich deserved all of their wealth. And this is going to be championed by figures such as Herbert Spencer. Contrasting this was the gospel of wealth, the belief that the wealthy had a moral responsibility to help out the less fortunate, and this is going to be echoed by people like Andrew Carnegie in his article, Wealth. The big idea is that because of industrialization, new ideas about the economy are going to emerge. Another thing you should know is the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. There's going to be growing outrage at expanding corporate power despite ideas like the gospel of wealth. So in 1890, Congress is going to pass the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this is going to outlaw trusts and monopolies that fix prices and snuffed out competition. However, it's important to keep in mind that this act is largely going to be ineffective and is actually going to be used to suppress labor unions, demonstrating a continuity of growing corporate power in the Gilded Age. For complexity, you can contrast this to the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was actually effective. So because of the growing power of big business, we're going to see a reaction against this, largely in the form of labor unions. However, these unions are going to face a lot of challenges. For example, there's tensions among skilled and unskilled workers, as well as ethnic and racial tensions. For example, Chinese immigrants were often excluded. There's a lot of corporate hostility without any government backing. In fact, you have a big pool of scabs who were replacement workers. Court injunctions are going to force workers back to work, and workers were sometimes forced to sign yellow dog contracts, which forced them to not join a union. And sometimes people were just straight up blacklisted or banned from working. For complexity, you could connect this back to the Hollywood 10 and those blacklisted during the Second Red Scare. Finally, the public during this time is going to view labor unions as radical. However, this eventually will change. Now let's cover some notable labor unions. The first one is the National Labor Union, which was the first to attempt to organize all workers across the country. They're going to push for 8-hour workdays and higher wages. However, this movement will not be sustained. The next one is the Knights of Labor, under the leadership of Terence Powderly. He's going to open the union to all, including skilled and unskilled workers, blacks, women, and others. This definitely is more social issue driven, however, then decline after the Haymarket riot in 1886. Finally, the most important one will be the American Federation of Labor. Under the leadership of Samuel Gompers, this union is going to focus on skilled workers only. They're not social focused, they're going to want to push for higher wages and better working conditions. And by 1900s, this is going to become the biggest union despite initial challenges. Now let's cover some notable examples of labor unrest. The big idea here is that as the inequality between corporations and workers grow, more and more labor unrest as well as violence will occur. There's a great railroad strike of 1877 where federal troops are going to be sent in by Hayes. There's also the Haymarket Square bombing, where a public meeting is going to be bombed by radical anarchists, causing labor unions to be viewed as too radical and dangerous, even though the labor union had nothing to do with the bombing. In the Homestead strike, Henry Clay Frick is going to use a lockout, private security, and scabs to defeat strikers at Carnegie's factory. This is going to turn the public view against hired help, and is going to damage Carnegie's reputation. Finally, there's the Pullman strike. After the Panic of 1893, there's going to be a lot of wage cuts. Workers are forced to continue to live at the Pullman Company town, which had high rent. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, will strike, eventually shutting down commerce in like 27 states. The strike is going to turn violent, and troops are going to be sent in. Keep this guy Eugene Debs in mind, he's a socialist and will come up later on. Now we're going to cover Gilded Age politics. For a quick overview of Gilded Age politics, the first big idea is that Gilded Age politics will be heavily tied to big business, focusing on economic issues like currency policy and tariffs. And both parties are going to be very pro-business. The Republicans are going to be backed by the freedmen, businessmen, middle class, as well as Protestants, while the Democrats are going to be backed by political machines and immigrants. Additionally, both political parties during the Gilded Age are going to largely ignore the political and social consequences of industrialization. And the major driving force of this is going to be laissez-faire capitalism, the belief that the government should stay out of the economy. Hence, politicians are going to ignore the social consequences of industrialization. The exception to this ignorance will be the Populist Party, of which we'll cover later on. The big idea is that politics during the Gilded Age will largely be marked by corruption, even though there were some reforms. We're going to start with Grant winning the presidency in 1868. Even though he has no political experience, he's a war hero and he will win. One major reason for this is because of the freedmen votes, as African Americans were temporarily voting in the South in large numbers. Grant's presidency is going to be absolutely riddled with scandals, even though he himself doesn't benefit. The term Grantism is actually used to describe corruption in government and is coined because of the widespread corruption during Grant's presidency. For example, you have the Credit Mobilier affair, as we already covered, as well as the Whiskey Ring, in which Grant's personal secretary stole $3 million in a tax corruption scheme. And these are just two of the many scandals that riddled Grant's presidency. Perhaps the best symbol of corruption were political machines, the most notorious of which being the Democratic political machine Tammany Hall in New York. Here, Boss Tweed and his cronies are going to, quote, help out the urban poor, immigrants, and businesses in times of need in exchange for their loyalty and votes. Or sometimes just straight up intimidated them, stating that they would be nothing without him. He's going to use bribery, graft, and rigged elections to steal more than $200 million from taxpayers, all the while abusing the patronage system to reward his followers. However, he will be brought down by whistleblower Thomas Nass, who exposes all of this corruption through political cartoons. Don't worry though, obviously Tweed did try to stop Nass using threats and intimidation as well. One thing you should know is the Panic of 1873. The big idea here is that the Panic of 1873 is going to spark debates over currency policy that will later on re-emerge in the 1890s. We're going to see some pretty severe economic collapse. We're going to see mass unemployment, banks failing, and others. And all this is going to distract from Reconstruction. There's a few reasons for this. There's overproduction as well as over-speculation. Farmers and debtors are going to be impacted the most, and they're going to push for a more lax currency policy with the printing of greenbacks so that they have access to cheap money. Ultimately, the debate of hard currency versus greenbacks is going to reemerge later on in the 1890s with the Grange movement. Now for election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877. The big idea is the Compromise of 1877 is going to mark the official end of Reconstruction. So how does this happen? Well, in the election of 1876, you have Republican Hayes running against the Democrat Tilden. There's going to be a political controversy as results are going to be contested in 3 southern states. So the Compromise of 1877 is going to be created. The Democrats are going to recognize Hayes as the president, but they're going to want federal troops to be pulled out of the South. They're also going to want Hayes to give South patronage, as well as federal support for a transcontinental railroad. Ultimately, this is going to end Reconstruction because troops are no longer there to enforce Reconstruction, and the results are going to be disastrous for the freedmen. It's not just federal troops, though. Reconstruction is actually going to be directly challenged by the Supreme Court. The big idea is that Supreme Court cases during this time will start to undermine Reconstruction. For example, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 made it illegal for individuals to be denied full and equal use of public spaces, and also stated that you cannot discriminate based on race in jury selection, protecting African Americans. But in the civil rights cases of 1883, the Supreme Court pretty much rules that the 14th Amendment only protects against government violations, not private violations, effectively overturning the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So as a result, Jim Crow laws are going to spread everywhere. The big case that you need to know is Plessy v. Ferguson, where the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was constitutional. That is, segregation is legal so long as facilities were equal. Obviously, it was never equal. And this notorious decision is going to end up protecting Jim Crow laws and segregation for the next half century. Now let's quickly go over this idea of the New South. The New South was this vision that the South would rebuild, industrialize, and diversify their economy, becoming stronger in the process. And to their credit, there were some railroad booms as well as industrialization. However, this is going to be very, very isolated. The South is largely going to remain an agrarian society and segregated. The big idea is that exploitative sharecropping and oppressive socio-economic conditions are going to persist for African Americans in the South. For example, 15th Amendment rights are going to be slowly stripped away by things like literacy tests, poll taxes, property requirements, and grandfather clauses that exempted whites. This disenfranchisement of African Americans is going to be a major step backwards in achieving racial equality. Ultimately, white supremacist Democrats, known as the Redeemers, are going to take over the South again. And this is going to be a stark contrast to the Republican and African American participation in the political landscape of the South during Reconstruction. Now we're going to cover Chinese immigration. During this time, we're going to see a massive increase in Asian, especially Chinese immigration. And these immigrants are going to be a major driving force in the gold rush population booms, as well as the building of railroads like the first transcontinental railroad. As a reaction to this immigration, we're going to see a spike in nativism to Chinese immigrants in the West. And we're going to cover more nativism later. The important part is that Congress is going to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned the further immigration of Chinese laborers and was the first racially targeted immigrant act. Now, there's going to be 3 major issues during Gilded Age politics, the first of which was civil service. The most important act for this is going to be the Pendleton Act, which was a stark contrast to the previous patronage system, where loyal supporters would get jobs. Obviously, the patronage system is going to lead to widespread corruption and incompetence. The Pendleton Act reformed this by requiring all civil servants to take a competitive exam to get the job. This meant that the system was now merit-based, not loyalty-based. While this should have been a win for democracy, it's going to mark the shift of politicians from loyal supporters to wealthy donors that we still see today. Now, tariffs. Tariffs in the Civil War are just going to be left in place, and by the 1880s, the US Treasury is going to have a massive surplus from tariffs. Around 50% of government revenue is actually going to come from tariffs. Obviously, farmers and consumers are not going to be happy over these higher prices and reciprocal tariffs put in place. And since the government already had so much money, many question why the tariffs still had to be in place. However, both Democrats and Republicans do not care and will not do anything to address this until later. In fact, you see the passage of the McKinley tariff, one of the highest tariffs in American history. This also contributes to the billion-dollar Congress, first time where Congress had a budget greater than $1 billion. Again, high tariffs gave the government a lot of money to spend. Additionally, the Dependent and Disability Pensions Act is going to extend Civil War pensions to veterans and others. Now for currency policy. We already covered a little bit of this, but the big idea is that debates over currency policy are going to emerge during this time. Farmers and debtors are going to push for greenbacks and eventually want the unlimited coinage of silver so that they can easily pay off their debts. However, bankers and investors, on the other hand, are going to want this gold standard for anti-inflation and the creation of a stable dollar. Now we're going to cover Gilded Age society, immigration, and urbanization. One major factor that changes society during this time period is going to be the increasing urbanization of America. The big idea is that the urbanization of America will have many social, economic, and political impacts, though not always positive. There's going to be a massive increase in urbanization during this time, and part of this growth is going to be due to new economic opportunities in factory systems. Keep in mind, a large part of this new labor force were immigrants. Technology is also going to support this growth. You have skyscrapers, the Bessemer process, which created cheap and strong steel, as well as electric streetcars, which allowed for better transportation and made it so that you didn't have to live in the city center anymore. And this is going to have some positive impact. For example, the role of women is going to start to shift, and some women are going to gain a sense of independence. There's going to be a lot of problems with urbanization. Again, one big idea is that there's going to be growing inequality between the poor and the rich. Urban poverty rates are going to spike, and the massive population boom means that urbanization is going to cause a lot of problems. We're going to see the rise of tenements, poorly constructed houses in very bad conditions. Here, there's going to be a lack of proper waste disposal, clean water, and poor ventilation. Because of this, diseases like cholera and tuberculosis are going to spread like crazy. Additionally, communities are not only segregated by class, but also ethnicity and race. For example, the practice of redlining was when African Americans were denied loans and mortgages because of where they lived, even if they personally qualified. And one example of communities being segregated by race is south side of Chicago. And as we covered previously, political machines were a huge problem because they tightly controlled politics in major cities. They persist because they did provide some basic welfare to the poor and immigrants, which weren't offered by the government then. So people are going to keep voting them in. There's going to be widespread corruption, fraud, intimidation, and graft. So the old immigrants are going to be any immigrants before the 1880s, like in antebellum America. They're largely going to immigrate from Northern and Western Europe, from countries like England, Ireland, and Germany. They're going to be largely Protestant, even though some are Catholic. They're going to be literate and skilled, and they are going to assimilate relatively quickly. These immigrants are going to come from countries with democracy and weren't completely poor. The new immigrants, on the other hand, are going to be from Southern and Eastern Europe, from countries like Italy, Russia, Poland, and Greece. Most weren't Protestant. They're going to be illiterate and unskilled, reluctant to assimilate, and they're going to come from countries with a history of radical ideas like communism and anarchism, and they're going to arrive very poor. Keep these differences in mind as we cover immigration. So what were the causes of immigration? Well, they're pretty much the same as before. For one, there's going to be a lot of pull factors. This is the American ideal of liberty, both political and religious freedom. There's going to be stories from previous generations of how America was this land of opportunity, and there's going to be a lot of economic opportunities in the growing factory system. As for push factors, there's going to be a lot of job loss because of industrialization and mechanization, and there's still going to be a lack of land and poverty in Europe. There's also political instability or the lack of political freedom in many countries, as well as religious persecution. For example, you see the pogroms in Russia. So what was this reaction to this new influx of immigrants? The big idea is that time and time again, as immigration increases, there's going to be a nativist counter-reaction against it. This time, the counter-reaction is going to be much more intense than before. Ellis Island is going to open up as an immigrant processing station, and it's going to become both an island of hope and an island of tears for immigrants. So what are the reasons for the nativist counter-reaction? Well, the new immigrants are going to be seen as racially inferior. They're also going to take jobs and lower wages. There's political reasons too. There's this perception that these immigrants were dangerous because they came from countries with communism and anarchism. And there's going to be religious reasons. The United States is going to be largely Protestant during this time. The new influx of non-Protestant immigrants is going to arouse a lot of suspicion. So what do these natives actually do? Well, we already saw the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. The American Protective Association is also going to be formed as well, and it's going to be an anti-Catholic group created by Protestants. They also have literacy tests for immigrants. There's going to be all sorts of vetoes, but eventually the Immigration Act of 1917 is going to be passed, requiring immigrants to pass a literacy test. And this is going to pass despite Woodrow Wilson's veto. Later on, the Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924 are going to severely restrict immigration from Asia and Europe, but that's for another time. Now, there's going to be a response to these growing issues. The big idea is that there's going to be a wide variety of ways in which people try to resolve the issues of immigration and urbanization. However, it's going to be mostly non-governmental during this time. However, this will change later. The big one that you should know is the social gospel movement, which was this belief that Christians had this moral responsibility to deal with urban poverty. There's also the Salvation Army, which comes over from England in 1879 and providing poverty relief, all the while spreading Christian values. Same thing with the YMCA and the YWCA. The other big thing you should know is the settlement house movement. What really kickstarts this is going to be the establishment of Whole House by Jane Addams, and for complexity, this is a really good example of how important women were in reforming society, which could tie into a feminist prompt. These settlement houses are going to provide social services like language education, childhood education, and more to immigrant communities and the urban poor. Now we're going to cover some societal ideas of the Gilded Age. The big idea is that new ideas about society is going to emerge as a result of the Gilded Age and Industrial Revolution. On one side, you have people who supported the social order. This kind of stems from the belief in the Protestant work ethic, that if you worked hard, you would become rich. You have people like Horatio Alger, who wrote Ragged Dick and Struggling Upwards, a rags to riches story that echoed the idea of how hard work leads to success. And the experiences of people like Andrew Carnegie are really going to reinforce this, because he was an immigrant that became one of the richest men in the world. A very relevant complexity point is going to be tying this to the feasibility of the American dream today. Today, you have some people who advocate to just work hard, while others cite systemic issues that are causing inequality. Speaking of which, there's going to be a growing number of critics of the inequality created by the Gilded Age and big business. For example, Henry George is going to write Progress and Poverty, which examined and criticized the inequality created by industrialization and laissez-faire capitalism. You also have Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, which envisioned a socialist utopia that addressed the injustices of the time, implying the need for reform. For complexity, you could even tie this to previous utopian experiments like New Harmony and Brook Farm, all the way back in the 1830s and 40s. Ultimately, all of this is going to drive reform in the progressive movement, something that we're going to cover in another unit. Key to this movement is going to be the rise of the press, education reform, and the spike in literacy rates. For complexity, you can talk about how Horace Mann's education reform earlier on in the century kind of kick off this progressive movement. Now we're going to cover the African American responses to the Gilded Age. Recall how Reconstruction is going to end during the Gilded Age. Combined with a rapidly changing society because of industrialization and urbanization, you're going to get this really strange situation for African Americans. The big idea is that contrasting views on civil rights and African Americans is going to emerge during this time. On one side, you have Booker T. Washington. He's from the South and was an ex-slave. He writes an autobiography, Up From Slavery. And Washington is going to argue that African Americans should acquire skills to become economically independent. He's really going to push for the self-reliance and self-help instead of trying to drive reform through the ballot box. He argued instead that gaining economic independence would gradually achieve civil rights and would be easier to do. To accomplish this, he's going to form the Tuskegee Institute. And Washington is going to have a much more gradual approach, and critics are going to call him an accommodationist of white supremacy. On the other hand, you have W.E.B. Du Bois. He's going to be from the North and is actually the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He founded the NAACP and is really going to push for the immediate political and social equality for African Americans. And if you've forgotten the significance of these, then please watch APUSH Unit 5 review. So what about the economy of the West? The big idea is that the economy of the West is largely going to be a boom-bust cycle during this time. The first major industry that we're going to see is the mining industry. Some famous booms are the California Gold Rush, Pikes Peak, and the Comstock Lode. Obviously, mining conditions are very dangerous, and remember that there's going to be a major immigrant population during this time. The mining industry is going to have a big impact. It's going to devastate the environment and cause a lot of conflicts with natives. The other major industry during this time was the cattle industry. Vaqueros or Mexican cowboys have been doing this for a long time. They're just going to use the vast open grasslands to have the cattle graze and profit off the cattle. Railroads are going to aid this industry by opening up new markets and offering better transportation. But instability is going to come in the form of overgrazing, harsh winters, and barbed wires, the latter of which will eventually really restrict the cattle industry. Now, it's important to keep in mind the reality of life in the West. Life in the West is really going to be romanticized by literature and paintings, but this view really ignores the complexities of the native issue and the reality of Western life. So what was the reality? Well, we're going to see this big melting pot of Chinese immigrants, African Americans, vaqueros, and Mormons. And one term you should know are the exodusters, which describes African Americans who moved west to escape segregation in the South. Additionally, women's suffrage is much more common, and this is partially done to encourage women to come out west. Wyoming is actually going to be the first state to grant women's suffrage. We can't talk about westward expansion without talking about Native Americans. The big idea is that Native way of life had been greatly disturbed and encroached upon by Americans. This will be the greatest impact of westward expansion. Some major tribes in the Great Plains regions are going to be the Sioux, Blackfoot, and the Comanche tribes. And pretty much all of these tribes are going to rely heavily on bison. And keep in mind that even before westward expansion, natives are going to be heavily impacted by the Columbian Exchange. The horse changed how natives hunted buffalo, guns changed warfare, and obviously disease is going to decimate native populations. But during this time, we're going to see increasing pressures on natives. Major factors include the severe decline in the buffalo population, as well as the encroachment of native land. and all this is going to lead to very violent conflict. Again, the big idea is that great violence will occur as Americans move west into native land. There's the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where a Colorado militia kills over 100 natives, many of whom were women and children. In the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Sioux tribe, led by their leader Sitting Bull, is going to defeat the 7th Cavalry in what's known as Custer's Last Stand, and Chief Joseph is going to attempt to lead the Nez Perce tribe into Canada. One thing you should know is the Ghost Dance movement, which is going to spring up in the 1880s and 1890s, and it's going to spread to the Sioux tribe. This movement was a cultural and religious revival for the Native Americans, and they believed that by dressing up as their deceased ancestors, they would be able to banish the settlers that were encroaching their lands. And obviously, the government wants this to stop. And in 1890, the Battle of Wounded Knee happens. It's not a battle at all. It's a massacre of 200 natives by the U.S. Army in Dakota. And this is going to mark the end of major native wars on the frontier. Now, there were some attempts at assimilation. The big idea is that varying viewpoints on the native issue and the treatment of natives is going to emerge during this time. For example, some sharply criticized the government's treatment of Native Americans, like Helen Hunt Jackson. She wrote A Century of Dishonor, which documented the abuses of the federal government against natives. Others are going to argue for forced assimilation, and this ultimately will be pursued. You have boarding schools like the Carlisle boarding schools that were meant to, quote, civilize the Native Americans and assimilate them into American society, or really just destroy their culture. The big act that you must know is the Dawes Severalty Act, which ended the tribal ownership of land. Reservations were now split into 160-acre farms. Additionally, natives could obtain citizenship if they lived on the land and became, quote, civilized, which was really just cultural destruction. The remaining land is going to be sold off to settlers, and this was frequently the best land. Ultimately, the Dawes Act is going to be a massive failure for natives. One important idea during this time is the closing of the frontier. The Oklahoma land rush is going to occur in 1889, and it's the last big land rush because it's quite literally the only territory left. Recall that Oklahoma was originally reserved for natives in Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830. Frederick Jackson Turner is going to publish the significance of the frontier in American history, and he really popularizes this idea that the frontier had closed in 1890. He also asserts the importance of the frontier on American identity. Going out west fostered individualism, and in a way curbed inequality because you could always just head out west when times were tough. However, it's important to keep in mind that this Turner thesis does ignore the contributions of natives, women, and the fact that during the 1890s, the majority of people were actually moving to the cities, not the frontier. Regardless, the closing of the frontier can be seen as a cost to American imperialism that we're going to cover next unit. So the agricultural revolution is going to take place, and it's going to cause farming to become more commercialized, industrialized, and specialized. And this creates a lot of problems for farmers. We're going to see decreasing prices, the abuses of the railroad industry, high costs of machinery, a tight money supply, as well as high tariffs. So farmers will organize, and the biggest one that you need to know is the Grange movement. They're going to push for reform, calling for more government regulation of big business. They're also going to petition state legislatures, and some progress is made. In Munn v. Illinois, the Supreme Court ruled that the states can regulate railroads. However, in the Wabash case, the court ruled that states cannot regulate interstate commerce. This will lead to the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act. Another organization of farmers is the Farmers Alliance, but this is going to exclude black farmers and tenant farmers. The biggest one is going to be the Populist Party, an actual political party meant to represent the interests of farmers. They're going to push for government regulation of big businesses, especially railroads. They're also going to push for bimetallism, a graduated income tax, as well as the direct election of senators, the use of initiatives, and referendums. An initiative is a process to propose policies to policymakers, while a referendum is where voters directly vote on an issue. It's important to note that some of these reforms were successful, like the passage of the 17th Amendment. However, the Populist Party is going to fade away after the election of 1896, as Democrats are going to start taking up many populist reforms. That is all for APUSH Unit 6 review. If you found this video helpful, then please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. Thank you for watching.